The frozen pond cracked beneath Sarah Thompson's boots with a sound like a gunshot, and before she could scream, the ice gave way and plunged her into water so cold it felt like 1,000 knives stabbing into her flesh all at once. The winter of 1877 had been brutal in Montana City, Montana, turning the landscape into a crystalline prison of white and gray. Sarah had been warned not to cross the pond behind the mercantile, but she was running late to meet her father at the lumber mill, and the shortcut seemed worth the risk. Now, as the frigid water closed over her head and the current beneath the ice pulled her away from the hole she had fallen through, she realized how foolish that decision had been. Her heavy wool coat became an anchor, dragging her down even as her lungs screamed for air. She kicked desperately, her fingers scraping against the underside of the ice, searching for the opening. The world above was a murky blur of gray light filtering through the frozen surface. Panic consumed her as she clawed and fought, but the hole was gone, swept away by the current that moved beneath the deceptive stillness of the frozen pond. Sarah's thoughts fragmented into desperate prayers and memories of her mother's face, of morning coffee in the kitchen, of things she had never said and would never have the chance to say now. Her movements grew sluggish as the cold seeped into her bones, as her body began to surrender to the inevitable. Then, through the ice above her, she saw a dark shape moving fast. The sound of impact reverberated through the water as something heavy crashed through the frozen surface. Strong hands seized her coat and then her arms, hauling her upward with such force that she barely registered the transition from water to air. She broke the surface, gasping and choking, her body convulsing as Xavier Brooks dragged her across the broken ice toward the shore. He was a cowboy who worked at the ranch on the outskirts of town, broad-shouldered and strong, and right now he was saving her life. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, his own clothes soaked through from his plunge into the deadly water, but his grip on her never faltered. They reached the bank and he pulled her up onto solid ground, but the danger was far from over. The Montana winter was unforgiving, and wet clothes in this temperature meant death just as surely as drowning. Xavier wasted no time with questions or explanations. He stripped off his own soaked coat and then reached for hers, his fingers working quickly despite the cold that must have been numbing them. "We need to get you warm," he said, his voice urgent but steady. "My horse is tied up by the mercantile. Can you walk?" Sarah tried to answer, but her teeth were chattering so violently that no words would come. She nodded instead, and Xavier wrapped his arm around her waist, half carrying her as they stumbled through the snow. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding, waited where he had left it, and Xavier lifted Sarah into the saddle before swinging up behind her. He wrapped his arms around her, using his body to shield her from the wind as he urged the horse into a gallop. They did not head toward the center of town where her father's lumber mill stood. Instead, Xavier guided the horse toward a small cabin on the edge of the settlement, a place he rented from the widow who owned the boarding house. The ride took only minutes, but each second felt like an eternity as Sarah's body shook uncontrollably against Xavier's chest. He kicked open the cabin door and carried her inside, setting her down by the cold fireplace before rushing to build a fire. His movements were efficient and practiced, and soon flames were crackling to life, throwing heat into the small room. He disappeared into the back and returned with wool blankets and dry clothes. "You need to get out of those wet things," he said, his back already turned to give her privacy. "Everything. The cold will kill you otherwise." Sarah's fingers were too numb to work the buttons on her dress. She fumbled uselessly, frustration and fear bringing tears to her eyes. Xavier must have heard her struggling because he turned around, his expression carefully neutral. "I am going to help you," he said quietly. "I will not look any more than necessary, but we do not have time to be modest right now." He helped her out of the sodden layers of clothing, his touch brisk and impersonal despite the intimacy of the situation. He wrapped her in the dry blankets and positioned her close to the fire, then disappeared again to change his own clothes. When he returned, he was wearing dry trousers and a thick flannel shirt, and he carried 2 cups of something hot. "Whiskey and hot water," he explained, pressing a cup into her hands. "Drink it slowly." Sarah obeyed, the liquid burning down her throat and spreading warmth through her chest. Gradually, the violent shaking subsided into occasional tremors, and feeling began to return to her extremities in painful tingles. "Thank you," she finally managed to say, her voice hoarse. "You saved my life." Xavier shook his head, his green eyes serious in the firelight. "I just happened to be in the right place. I was coming out of the mercantile when I heard the ice crack. By the time I got there, you were already under." "You broke through the ice," Sarah said, the memory of that dark shape crashing toward her still vivid. "You could have died too." "But I did not," he said simply. "And neither did you. That is what matters." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Sarah studied Xavier's face, really looking at him for the first time. She had seen him around town before, of course. Montana City was not large enough for strangers to go unnoticed. He worked at the Bennett Ranch, breaking horses and mending fences, and he kept mostly to himself. She knew he was 24, just 3 years older than herself, and that he had come to Montana from Texas about 2 years ago. Beyond that, he was a mystery. "I should get word to my father," Sarah said eventually. "He will be worried when I do not show up at the mill." "It is nearly dark now," Xavier pointed out, glancing toward the window where twilight was indeed falling, "and you are still recovering." "I will go tell him you are safe and staying here for the night. You can use the bed. I will sleep by the fire." Before Sarah could protest, he was already pulling on his coat and heading for the door. She wanted to argue that it was not proper for her to stay unchaperoned in a man's cabin overnight, but the truth was she did not have the strength to make it home yet, and propriety seemed like a small concern compared to the fact that she was alive at all. Xavier returned an hour later with news that her father was relieved, she was safe, and had agreed she should stay put for the night. He also brought a basket of food from the boarding house, bread and stew and apple pie that the widow had sent over when she heard what had happened. They ate together by the fire, and gradually conversation began to flow more easily. Xavier told her about growing up on a ranch in Texas, about losing his parents to cholera and heading north to start fresh. Sarah told him about her own mother's death 5 years ago, about helping her father run the lumber mill office, about the books she loved to read, and the dreams she had of seeing more of the world than just Montana City. "Why did you take the shortcut across the pond?" Xavier asked. "Everyone knows it is not safe this time of year." Sarah felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. "I was late. My father needed the account books, and I had spent too long organizing the supply orders. It seemed like such a small risk at the time." "Small risks can have big consequences," Xavier said, but his tone was gentle, not judgmental. "I am glad I was there." "So am I," Sarah said softly, meeting his eyes. Something passed between them in that moment, a connection that went beyond gratitude or circumstance. Sarah felt it in the way her heart beat faster, in the way Xavier's gaze lingered on her face. The air between them seemed charged with possibility. That night, Sarah lay in Xavier's bed while he kept watch by the fire, and she found herself unable to sleep. Her mind kept replaying the moment his hands had seized her beneath the ice, the strength and certainty in his grip, the way he had not hesitated to risk his own life for hers. She had never had a man look at her, the way Xavier had looked at her by the firelight, as though she was something precious and worth protecting. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Sarah's clothes had dried by the fire, and she dressed behind the privacy curtain Xavier had rigged up. Her father arrived with the wagon before breakfast, relief evident on his weathered face as he embraced his daughter. "Thank you, Brooks," Henry Thompson said, shaking Xavier's hand firmly. "I owe you a debt I can never repay." "No debt necessary," Xavier replied. "I am just glad I was there." As Sarah climbed into the wagon, she looked back at Xavier standing in the doorway of his small cabin, and she felt an unexpected pang of regret that she was leaving. Their eyes met, and he raised his hand in farewell. She lifted her own hand in response, already hoping she would see him again soon. Over the following weeks, Sarah found excuses to visit the mercantile more often than necessary, lingering near the windows in hopes of catching a glimpse of Xavier's horse tied up outside. She learned his patterns, discovered that he came to town every Wednesday and Saturday for supplies. On the third Wednesday after the incident at the pond, she timed her visit perfectly and found herself standing next to him at the counter. "Miss Thompson," he said, surprise and pleasure evident in his voice. "How are you feeling?" "Completely recovered," she assured him. "Thanks to you." They talked for a few minutes, awkward and formal under the watchful eye of the mercantile owner, but when Sarah left, Xavier followed her outside. "I was wondering," he said, his confidence from the rescue seeming to have deserted him now, "if you might like to take a walk sometime. When the weather is better, somewhere far from frozen ponds." Sarah felt her face break into a smile. "I would like that very much." Their courtship began slowly, built on afternoon walks and careful conversations. Montana City was a small town where everyone knew everyone's business, and Sarah was conscious of the eyes that followed them whenever they appeared together. Her father approved of Xavier, grateful for the debt he owed the cowboy, but he warned Sarah to be cautious. "He is a good man," Henry said one evening over dinner, "but he is a drifter, Sarah. Men like that do not always stay put." "He has been here 2 years," Sarah pointed out. "That does not sound like a drifter to me." But her father's words planted a seed of doubt that she could not quite shake. As winter gave way to the muddy promise of spring, Sarah found herself falling deeper in love with Xavier, but always with that question lurking in the back of her mind. Would he stay, or would he eventually move on like the wind that swept across the Montana plains? Xavier seemed to sense her uncertainty. One April afternoon, as they walked along the creek that fed into the pond where Sarah had nearly drowned, he stopped and took both her hands in his. "I need to tell you something," he said. "I need you to understand why I came here and why I am staying." He told her then about Texas, about the ranch where he had grown up and the woman he had planned to marry. Her name had been Rebecca, and she had been the daughter of a neighboring rancher. They had been engaged, with the wedding planned for the fall of 1875. But 2 months before the wedding, Rebecca had run off with a gambler passing through town, leaving Xavier with a broken heart and the pitying looks of everyone who knew him. "I came to Montana to escape the memories," Xavier said, "to start somewhere no one knew my story or my shame. I took the job at the Bennett Ranch because it was as far from Texas as I could get without leaving the country. For 2 years I have been here, working and saving and trying to figure out what I want from life." "And have you figured it out?" Sarah asked, her heart pounding. "Yes," Xavier said simply. "I want you. I want a life here in Montana City. I want to stop running from the past and start building a future, but I need to know if you want the same thing." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "I have wanted that since the moment you pulled me from under the ice," she admitted, "but I was afraid you would leave." "I am not going anywhere," Xavier promised. "Not without you." He kissed her then, his lips warm and gentle against hers, and Sarah felt as though she was falling again, but this time there was no cold water waiting below. There was only Xavier's arms around her, and the solid ground beneath her feet, and the absolute certainty that this was where she was meant to be. Their engagement was announced in May, and the wedding was planned for July, after the spring planting was done and before the fall harvest began. Sarah threw herself into preparations, sewing her dress and planning the reception that would be held in the church hall. Xavier worked extra hours at the ranch, saving every penny toward buying a piece of land where they could build their own home. But fate, it seemed, was not done testing them. In late June, just 3 weeks before the wedding, a man rode into Montana City asking for Xavier Brooks. His name was James Turner, and he was a lawyer from Texas with news that would change everything. Xavier's uncle, his mother's brother who owned a large ranch near San Antonio, had died and left everything to Xavier. The ranch was worth a considerable sum, and Xavier was now a wealthy man. The news spread through town like wildfire, and suddenly people who had barely acknowledged Xavier before were treating him with new respect. Sarah watched the change with a mixture of pride and unease. The money meant they could build a bigger house, could afford luxuries she had never dreamed of. But it also meant Xavier had to return to Texas to settle the estate. "Come with me," Xavier said when he told her about the inheritance. "We can move up the wedding, leave next week. You can see Texas, meet the people I grew up with. We can decide together whether to keep the ranch or sell it and come back here." But Sarah's father had fallen ill with a fever, and she could not leave him, not when he needed her most. Xavier understood, but she could see the disappointment in his eyes. "I will go settle the estate," he said. "It should take 6 weeks, maybe 2 months. We can have the wedding when I return in late August instead." "What if you get to Texas and decide you want to stay?" Sarah asked, her old fear rising up again. Xavier cupped her face in his hands. "I am coming back," he said firmly. "I am coming back to you. Texas is my past, Sarah. You are my future." He left on the stage the next morning, and Sarah stood in the street watching until the coach disappeared over the horizon. The days that followed were long and lonely. Her father recovered slowly from his fever, but the illness left him weakened, and Sarah had to take on more responsibility at the lumber mill. She threw herself into work, trying not to count the days since Xavier had left, trying not to imagine all the things that could go wrong. Letters arrived every 2 weeks, carried by the stage. Xavier wrote about the ranch, about the lawyer's complications and the long process of settling the estate. He wrote about missing her, about the life they would build together when he returned. Sarah carried the letters in her pocket and read them so many times the paper grew soft and worn. But as June turned to July and July dragged toward August, a different kind of letter arrived. It was not from Xavier, but from a woman named Catherine Bennett, who identified herself as a distant cousin of Xavier's late uncle. She wrote that Xavier had been spending a great deal of time at the ranch, that he seemed to be settling back into Texas life quite comfortably. She mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Rebecca, Xavier's former fiancée, had returned to the area after her gambler husband had died, and that she had been seen visiting the ranch. Sarah read the letter 3 times, each reading making her heart feel heavier. She told herself not to jump to conclusions, that Catherine Bennett was probably just a gossip stirring up trouble. But doubt crept in like winter frost, and she found herself lying awake at night wondering if Xavier's promise to return had been as fragile as spring ice. August arrived with scorching heat that baked the streets of Montana City into hard, packed dust. The date they had originally chosen for the wedding came and went with no word from Xavier. Sarah's hope began to crack and splinter. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon when the sun hung white and merciless in the sky, the stagecoach rolled into town. Sarah was at the mercantile, picking up flour for the boarding-house widow who had taken ill, when she heard the commotion outside. Her heart leapt, and she rushed to the door. Xavier climbed down from the coach, dusty and travel-worn but unmistakably there. His eyes scanned the street until they found her, and then he was moving toward her with long strides that ate up the distance between them. "I am sorry I am late," he said when he reached her. The estate took longer than expected, and then there were complications with the sale. "The sale," Sarah repeated. "I sold the ranch," Xavier explained. "I sold everything except a few personal items that belonged to my mother. I do not want that life, Sarah. I want the life we planned here." Relief flooded through Sarah so intensely she felt dizzy with it. "There was a letter," she said, "from a woman named Catherine Bennett. She said Rebecca had come back." Xavier's expression hardened. "Catherine is my uncle's widow's niece, and she is a meddling gossip." "Yes, Rebecca showed up at the ranch. She heard about the inheritance and thought she could talk her way back into my life. I told her I was engaged to the most wonderful woman in Montana and sent her on her way. That is all there is to that story." "I should not have doubted you," Sarah said. "You had every reason to doubt," Xavier replied. "I left you here for 3 months with nothing but letters and promises. But I am back now, and I am not leaving again. Can we still have that wedding, or have I ruined everything?" Sarah laughed, and it came out half-sob. "We can still have the wedding. The dress is finished and waiting. The church is already booked for next Saturday. The widow has been making so much food I think she is planning to feed half the territory." Xavier pulled her into his arms right there on the street, not caring who saw them. "I love you, Sarah Thompson," he said. "I loved you from the moment I saw you fighting so hard under that ice, refusing to give up. I will love you until the day I die." "I love you too," Sarah whispered against his chest. "I think I started loving you the moment your hands found me in the dark water." Their wedding took place on a perfect August Saturday with the whole town in attendance. Sarah wore a dress of cream-colored silk that she had sewn herself, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Xavier wore a new suit bought with his inheritance money, dark and formal and impossibly handsome. They exchanged their vows in the small church where Sarah had been baptized as a child, where her mother's funeral had been held, where now she was beginning a new chapter of her life. The reception lasted well into the evening, with fiddle music and dancing and more food than anyone could eat. Sarah's father stood to give a toast, his voice still weak from his illness but his words strong. "To the man who saved my daughter's life," Henry said, raising his glass. "And to my daughter, who saved his heart. May your marriage be as enduring as Montana stone and as warm as summer sun." Xavier used the money from the ranch sale to buy 60 acres just outside town, land with good water and rich soil. They built a house there. Not a mansion, but a comfortable home with large windows that let in the light and a porch where they could sit on summer evenings and watch the sun set over the mountains. Xavier continued working at the Bennett Ranch, but now as a partner rather than a hired hand, investing some of his inheritance into expanding the horse breeding program. Sarah kept her position at the lumber mill, working alongside her father and gradually taking over more of the business as his health continued to be fragile. She proved to have a head for figures and negotiations, and under her management, the mill prospered. In the evenings, she would ride out to the ranch to meet Xavier, and they would go home together to the house they had built. Their first winter as a married couple was mild compared to the one that had nearly claimed Sarah's life. Still, when snow began to fall in November, Sarah could not help the shiver of memory that ran through her. Xavier noticed, as he always seemed to notice everything about her, and he pulled her close. "You are safe," he murmured. "I will always keep you safe." "I know," Sarah said, and she meant it. In March of 1879, their first child was born, a boy they named Thomas Henry after both his grandfathers. Sarah had been terrified during the pregnancy, haunted by memories of her own mother's death in childbirth. But Xavier never left her side during the labor, and the local midwife was skilled and calm. When Thomas was placed in Sarah's arms, red-faced and squalling, she felt a love so fierce it nearly overwhelmed her. Xavier proved to be a devoted father, up at all hours helping with the baby, patient when Thomas cried through the night, endlessly amazed by each milestone. Sarah would watch him holding their son, this strong cowboy who had pulled her from frozen death now cradling new life with such tenderness. And she would think about how strange and wonderful fate could be. The years that followed brought both joys and sorrows. Sarah's father died peacefully in his sleep in 1881, and she grieved him deeply, but took comfort in knowing she had given him 2 grandchildren to love before he passed. Their daughter, Emma Rose, had been born the previous fall, and Henry Thompson had spent hours rocking her and telling her stories from his own childhood. Sarah took over the lumber mill completely, running it with efficiency and fairness. She became known throughout the territory as a shrewd businesswoman, someone who drove a hard bargain but always kept her word. Xavier expanded the ranch operation, breeding horses that were sought after throughout Montana and beyond. Together, they became one of the most successful couples in Montana City, their prosperity built on hard work and mutual support. But for all their success, it was the small moments that Sarah treasured most. Xavier still brought her coffee every morning, exactly the way she liked it. She still mended his shirts even though they could afford to buy new ones, because she liked the quiet intimacy of the task. They still took walks together whenever they could, though now they were trailed by 2 children who demanded constant attention and answered every question with a dozen more. On the 5-year anniversary of the day Sarah had fallen through the ice, Xavier took her back to the pond. It was summer now, and the water sparkled in the sunlight, peaceful and innocent-looking. They stood on the bank where he had pulled her to safety, watching dragonflies skim across the surface. "You ever think about how different things might have been?" Sarah asked. "If you had not been there that day, if you had been a minute later?" "Every day," Xavier admitted. "Not with fear, but with gratitude. That moment brought me to you. It gave me everything I did not even know I wanted." "I was so scared," Sarah said softly. "Under the ice, when I could not find the opening, I thought I was going to die. I remember thinking about all the things I would never get to do, all the life I would never live. And then you were there." Xavier turned her to face him, his green eyes serious. "You fought so hard to stay alive, Sarah. I saw it, even under the water. You were not going to give up." "Maybe I helped, but you saved yourself too." "We saved each other," Sarah said. "You pulled me from the ice and I pulled you back to life after Rebecca broke your heart. We are even." Xavier smiled, that rare, full smile that transformed his whole face. "Is that what we are? Even?" "No," Sarah said, standing on her toes to kiss him. "We are blessed." More years passed, bringing more children. A second son, William, arrived in 1883 and another daughter, Lucy, in 1886. The house that had seemed so spacious when they first built, it now rang with the noise and chaos of 4 children. And Sarah and Xavier talked about adding another wing. Thomas grew tall and serious like his grandfather, showing an aptitude for business that delighted Sarah. Emma inherited Xavier's way with horses and could often be found in the stables when she should have been doing her lessons. William was the charmer of the family, quick with a joke and a smile. Lucy, the baby, was too young yet to show her personality fully, but she had Sarah's determined stubbornness and Xavier's fearless nature, a combination that promised future trouble. The town grew around them, changing from a rough frontier settlement into a proper community with a school, a real hotel, and even a newspaper. Sarah served on the school board and helped organize a library, donating books from her own collection and soliciting more from merchants in Helena. Xavier was elected to the town council, though he grumbled about meetings and politics and would have much rather spent his time with the horses. Through it all, their love deepened and matured. The passionate intensity of their early days together mellowed into something richer and more complex. They knew each other's moods and habits, could communicate with a glance across a crowded room, finished each other's sentences, and still found new things to talk about over dinner. They argued sometimes, usually about money or how to discipline the children, but they had learned how to fight fair and how to forgive. In 1891, 14 years after Xavier had pulled Sarah from beneath the ice, they took a trip together without the children for the first time. They traveled to San Francisco, something Sarah had always dreamed of doing. They saw the ocean and ate at fancy restaurants and stayed in a hotel where someone else made the beds and brought them breakfast. It was wonderful and exciting, but by the end of the week, they both missed Montana and their children and the life they had built. On the train ride home, Sarah rested her head on Xavier's shoulder and watched the landscape roll past the window. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Staying in Montana City, we could have gone anywhere, done anything." "Never," Xavier said without hesitation. "This is where I found you. This is where we built our life. Why would I want to be anywhere else?" Sarah thought about the girl she had been at 21, late to meet her father, taking a foolish shortcut across dangerous ice. That girl had been so focused on the destination that she had nearly died before reaching it. The woman she was now understood that the journey mattered as much as the destination, that detours and delays could lead to unexpected blessings. They arrived home to chaos, as always. The children swarmed them at the door, all talking at once about everything that had happened in the week they had been gone. Thomas, now 12, had apparently taken his role as temporary man of the house very seriously, and had a list of things he needed to discuss with his father. Emma, 10, dragged Sarah to the stables to see a new foal that had been born while they were away. William and Lucy simply clung to them, thrilled to have their parents back. That night, after the children were finally in bed and the house was quiet, Sarah and Xavier sat together on the porch as they had done 1,000 times before. The stars were bright overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. "I have been thinking," Xavier said, "about expanding the ranch, maybe bringing Thomas into the business in a few years when he is old enough, teaching him what I know about horses." "He would like that," Sarah said, "though I think Emma is the one who really has your gift with animals." "She can join too," Xavier said. "All of them can if they want to. We can build something that lasts beyond us." Sarah took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "We already have," she said. "We have built a family and a home and a good life. That is a legacy worth leaving." As the years continued to unfold, their children grew and began to make their own paths in the world. Thomas did indeed join Xavier in the ranching business, proving to have both his mother's business acumen and his father's patience with animals. Emma surprised everyone by becoming a veterinarian, traveling to Chicago to study at one of the few colleges that would accept women in such a program. William took over the lumber mill, modernizing operations and expanding into new territories. Lucy, true to her nature, became a teacher and eventually principal of the Montana City School. Sarah and Xavier grew older gracefully, their hair turning silver, their movements slower but no less certain. They became the kind of couple younger people pointed to as an example of enduring love, the kind who still held hands when they walked through town, who still looked at each other as though they were the most interesting person in any room. In 1902, 25 years after the incident at the pond, Montana City held a celebration of its 50th anniversary as an incorporated town. As part of the festivities, the mayor asked Xavier and Sarah to share the story of how they met. They stood together on a platform in the town square, their grown children and numerous grandchildren in the crowd before them. Xavier told the story simply and honestly, about hearing the ice crack, about diving in without thinking, about pulling a fighting, determined woman from beneath the frozen surface. Sarah added her perspective, about the terror of being trapped under the ice, about the moment strong hands found her in the dark, about the cowboy who had given her not just her life back but a life beyond anything she had imagined. "The thing people do not always understand about being saved," Sarah said to the crowd, "is that it is not just about the moment of rescue. Xavier has been saving me every day for 25 years in 1,000 small ways. By believing in me when I wanted to keep working at the mill. By supporting my dreams even when they were unconventional. By being a partner, not just a husband. That is what love is. Not one grand gesture, but a lifetime of choosing each other every single day." Xavier squeezed her hand. "And Sarah has saved me just as surely. From loneliness, from bitterness, from a life without purpose or joy. We saved each other. We still do." The crowd applauded, but Sarah barely heard them. She was looking at Xavier, at the face she knew as well as her own, at the man who had been her husband for 23 years and her love for even longer. She thought about all the moments that had led them to this one, about the fragile nature of chance and choice. If she had not been late that day, if Xavier had not emerged from the mercantile at exactly the right moment, if the ice had been a little thicker or the current a little stronger, if he had hesitated even for a second, so many tiny variables that could have changed everything. But they had not changed. The ice had cracked. Xavier had not hesitated. And from that moment of terror and rescue, an entire life had grown. Children and grandchildren, a ranch and a business, a home filled with love and laughter. 2 lives woven so thoroughly together that neither could imagine being separate anymore. That night, after the celebrations had ended and they were back in their own house, Sarah and Xavier sat once more on the porch. It was a warm summer evening, reminiscent of that first summer they had courted, walking carefully around each other and trying to understand the feelings growing between them. "You remember what you said to me the night I stayed in your cabin?" Sarah asked. "After the accident." Xavier thought for a moment. "I said a lot of things." "Which part?" "You said small risks can have big consequences," Sarah reminded him. "You were right, but not in the way you meant. Taking that shortcut across the pond was a small risk that almost killed me. But it also led me to you, and that has been the biggest, best consequence of my entire life." Xavier pulled her close, and Sarah rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart. They sat there in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky, grateful for every moment that had brought them to this place, grateful for every moment still to come. The years that followed were gentler, quieter. Their children had their own families now, their own stories to live. Sarah eventually retired from the lumber mill, turning it over entirely to William, though she still went by the office occasionally to offer advice. Xavier spent more time teaching Thomas and his oldest grandson about horses, passing on knowledge accumulated over a lifetime. They traveled some, took trips to visit Emma in Chicago and Lucy in Helena, where she had moved with her husband, but mostly they stayed home. They had built something precious in Montana City, something worth tending. They worked in the garden Sarah had planted years ago, now lush and mature. They read books together in the evenings. They still took walks, though shorter ones now, and always well away from the pond that had brought them together. On a crisp October afternoon in 1905, Sarah and Xavier stood at the same pond once more. It was their ritual now, to come here on the anniversary of that long-ago day. The leaves were turning gold and red, and the air smelled of autumn smoke and approaching winter. 28 years, Sarah said wonderingly. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, sometimes it feels like forever. Both, Xavier agreed. Time is strange that way. They stood in silence, watching the light change on the water. Sarah thought about the terrified girl who had gone under this ice, how young and unformed she had been, how little she had known about life or love, or what she was capable of enduring and creating. She thought about all the versions of herself she had been since then. Nervous bride, new mother, grieving daughter, successful businesswoman, grandmother, friend. All those selves had grown from that moment of near death and rescue. "Thank you," she said suddenly. Xavier looked at her questioningly. "For what?" "For jumping in," Sarah said. "For not hesitating. For giving me the chance to become the woman I am now. For giving me this life." "Sarah," Xavier said gently, "you would have been extraordinary no matter what. I am just grateful I got to be part of it." They walked home slowly as the sun set behind them, casting long shadows across the familiar landscape. The house came into view, smoke rising from the chimney, lights glowing in the windows. Their grandson's horse was tied up outside, which meant family had come to visit, which meant laughter and noise and probably staying up too late. Sarah squeezed Xavier's hand. "Let us go home," she said. "We are home," Xavier replied. "We have been home since the moment we found each other." And he was right. Home was not just a place or a building. It was this man beside her, this life they had built together from a moment of crisis and courage. It was every choice they had made to keep choosing each other, every obstacle they had overcome together, every joy they had celebrated side by side. They walked together toward the house, toward the family waiting inside, toward whatever years remained to them. The pond was behind them now, its ice and terror long past. Ahead was warmth and light and love that had endured for nearly 3 decades and would endure until their final breath. Sarah Thompson Brooks had been saved from drowning on a frozen winter day in 1877. But the real salvation had been everything that came after. The love that grew from gratitude, the partnership that deepened into something unbreakable, the family that flourished, the life that exceeded every dream she had ever had. Xavier had pulled her from beneath the ice that day. But they had saved each other in every day since. And they would keep saving each other, keep choosing each other, keep loving each other until the very end. That was the story. Not just of a rescue, but of everything that grew from it. Not just of survival, but of truly living. Not just of 2 people who met by chance, but of 2 souls who recognized each other and refused to let go. And as they stepped through the door of their home together, surrounded by the noise and warmth of family, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she would not change a single thing. Not the fear, not the cold, not the moment the ice gave way. Because all of it, every terrifying second, had been the price of admission to this beautiful, precious, extraordinary life. They lived many more years together in happiness and health, watching their grandchildren grow and even welcoming great-grandchildren into the world. They saw the new century unfold with its changes and challenges, always facing it together. And when Xavier finally passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 74, Sarah held his hand and whispered her gratitude one last time for the cowboy who had broken through the ice and dragged her out, for the man who had loved her without reservation for nearly 50 years. She followed him 2 years later, surrounded by the family they had created, at peace with the life they had lived. They were buried side by side in the Montana City Cemetery, under a headstone that read simply, "Together in life, together in eternity." And in the town they had helped build, in the businesses they had founded, in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their legacy forward, in the stories told about the cowboy and the woman he saved from drowning, their love lived on, as enduring as the mountains themselves.